Sometimes less is more, especially when you're thinking about the art of storytelling. There's so much skill required in trying to fit a monologue's worth of emotion into a single sentence, and even more work is needed to convey that meaning through a completely nonverbal scene. And in my opinion, Look Back is one of the most impressive examples of this ultimate goal of storytelling, managing to fit large chunks of its message into nonverbal scenes and repeated instances of shot framing and composition. In order to understand the subtle message in Look Back's visual symbolism, let's take a look at what I would consider the foundational shot of the entire film. This scene frames Fujino at the center of her room, completely focused on the manga panel that she's drawing. The composition of the shot is cluttered, but in a way that feels deeply cozy. The warm glow of her table lamp and the darkness outside of the window in front of her, it reminds me of how it felt to stay up late on a school night out of pure investment in whatever you're doing. It's a simple yet resonant feeling. This shot is what brings us into this world. It anchors us in this pure and childlike point of view, but not in a way that feels demeaning. Fujino is a very straightforward reflection of youth, flawed and immature but deeply passionate in a way that's hard to not relate to. And this scene is meant to embody the way that she starts this story. The struggle of working on something you care about far deeper into the night than you probably should have. But this specific composition isn't just used for the first scene of this film. It's a type of visual language that's repeated over and over through Look Back, with subtly different messages every single time. The next moment this shot shows up is about 10 minutes into this movie, and instead of a thoughtful long scene of Fujino drawing like before, this shot is used a bunch of times in quick succession as part of Fujino's training montage. This is the point in the story where Fujino first encounters Kiyomoto's drawings in the school newspaper and finds the resolve to start practicing art. There's a sort of silly and toxic air to the sequence, since Fujino is trying to get better at drawing pretty much fully out of spite to Kiyomoto. But even still, these shots retain their color and upbeat air. Fujino does deeply love drawing, and even though her motivations are a bit petty, this is a wonderful depiction of someone getting to dive headfirst into the thing they love. As a bit of a side note, I wanted to briefly talk about how grounded the camera always feels in these shots. Tatsuki Fujimoto, the author of Look Back and inspiration for the entire story, is clearly a fan of classic cinematography and movies. It's a huge thing in his other works, becoming the entire story of Goodbye Eri and a massive part of Fire Punch. And I think this love for classic movie making comes through in a lot of his anime. While it's not something you may at first notice, almost every one of these scenes is shot with classic cinematography techniques. It always feels like there was thought put into how these moments would be filmed using an actual camera. And that's just something that I feel helps the overall sense of realism in all of his works. There's a groundedness that's almost foreign to the world of animation. The next time this specific shot shows its face is during another montage later in the film. This time after Fujino and Kiyomoto have finally met in person and started working together on their own manga. This sequence serves to depict the process in which the pair finally finished their first one-shot. The lighting is once again very bright and inviting, and the shot feels even more full than before, with Kiyomoto taking up the bottom right of the composition. As a bit of a background on where we're headed, I think there's a huge amount of symbolic meaning in the use of doors, rooms, and windows in Look Back. These pieces of imagery are used pretty much constantly throughout the movie and appear in some pretty crucial moments. The foundational shot that I keep mentioning has a large central window as its backdrop, and the comic panel slipping under the door into Kiyomoto's room is a massive moment that gets brought back later on. And in conjunction with these pieces of imagery, I think this specific shot composition is used to convey a similar importance. The whole point of this shot as it's been used so far is to highlight a center. Fujino in these instances, always hard at work in the very center of her room. This implies a very focused field of view, with the attention and importance being with this one main character. And in this most recent montage, we see what that means for Kiyomoto. She's a bystander in this shot, sitting in the bottom right working just as hard as Fujino, but still off to the side. This implies a sort of hierarchy, where Fujino is somehow more important and more central than her only friend. And that's the first thing that I think this style of shot is meant to convey. It's used to depict the different perspectives and points of views of its characters. As a young and kind of selfish kid, Fujino is always at the center of these scenes. She's at the center of her own world. And Kiyomoto is just someone who stepped into a room and is supporting her, but ultimately is nothing more than a side character. So if we consider this all together, this specific shot composition and the concept of rooms in general are meant to symbolize the minds and worldviews of certain characters. And thus, windows and doors are meant to embody a sort of path between these different rooms, between different mindsets and personalities. That's why Kiyomoto's very first scene is of her charging through a door, stepping out of her own world and into Fujino's. But unfortunately, Fujino's world is too small for Kyomoto to stay in. Over the course of the following montage, we see a number of other scenes of the pair working together on their manga, with Kyomoto always in the same spot in Fujino's room. And even as they're out and about, Fujino is pretty much always the active focus, saying something to make Kyomoto laugh, talking for the both of them, or leading the two around. Fujino is still only focused on herself, and even though she enjoys having Kyomoto around, she clearly isn't mature enough to view the relationship from a more even point of view. And this comes to a head at the very end of the montage, where Kyomoto finally declares that she wants to go to art school and learn how to paint. In this scene, we get to hear a lot of what Fujino thinks about Kyomoto, and a lot of it lines up with the imagery and symbolism that we covered earlier. Fujino mocks Kyomoto's dreams and says that she's never going to make it on her own, showing a very toxic and defensive mindset when faced with the idea of Kyomoto establishing her own identity. And this is shown in the framing of the shot too. For once, the pair are both the same size in the composition and are separated by the outline of a dead tree. Kyomoto has finally separated herself from being a background character in Fujino's world, and the scene mirrors that, with the tree almost looking like a chasm spreading between the two of them. Fujino doesn't yet have the ability to see Kyomoto as her own person. She's been comfortable only having to think about her as an extension of her own world. And this becomes the thing that eventually drives the pair apart. After the pair split, we follow Fujino through this new phase of her life, with the repeated composition of the scenes mirroring the montage that we saw earlier, where she first started delving deeper into art. Even as her manga starts doing better and better, there's this sense of melancholy throughout this newest chapter of her life. The color palette is more gray and there's never really a moment of celebration, even as Fujino achieves her dream. Something to note here is that Kyomoto never appears in any of these shots, even though she's an extremely important character to the story and most other movies would probably show some glimpse of what she's up to. But here, Kyomoto is very obviously being omitted, which further backs up the interpretation of these shots that I was talking about earlier. This movie is shot through the perspective of Fujino, and Kyomoto was only around as a sort of side piece to Fujino's world, which means that as soon as Kyomoto went off to do her own thing, she left Fujino's story almost entirely. After Fujino's rise to fame and success, we get to the most recent of this type of shot, where Fujino is sitting at work in a high-rise office building, clearly doing very well for herself financially. She now has a massive window in front of her, however the outside world is extremely foggy and dark. As we discussed earlier, I think that windows are meant to signify the ability to look outside of your own world and into someone else's, having empathy and self-awareness to understand other people's perspectives and lives. I think the fact that this window is larger now is no mistake. As she's grown older and moved to the city, she's been exposed to so many different people and their unique perspectives. She has the opportunity to step out into the world and explore all of the things that this city has to offer. But she's still not able to. She's still stuck in her own self-centered frame of view, which is reflected in the fact that the world outside of her window is foggy and obscured. Even as Fujino has attained great success as a mangaka, she clearly isn't doing great. In this scene itself, she's talking to her editor about needing new assistants, complaining that none of them are good enough to match her. Some part of her is still stuck in her own head, wondering why people can't keep up with her despite her own self-centeredness and lack of empathy. And this can further be seen in how dark her room is. Even in those earlier montages, no matter how dark it was outside, Fujino was always painted with this bright and energetic color palette. But now she's at her lowest point, and so for the first time the silhouette of her in front of her desk is fully dark. During this scene, Fujino receives a call from her mom telling her that Kyomoto is dead, caught up in the killing spree of a man who believed his art was stolen. Clearly broken apart from this news, Fujino visits Kyomoto's room but is too scared to step inside. She blames herself for dragging Kyomoto out of her room and inadvertently getting her killed. And this is the part of the story that I've seen most people get confused over. In the present, Fujino rips up the comic strip that once convinced Kyomoto to leave her room, which then slips under Kyomoto's door and seemingly travels into the past. From there, we watch an alternate series of events from Kyomoto's point of view, where she never met Fujino but ended up falling in love with art anyways, eventually going to the same school and getting caught up in the same attack. But in this timeline, Fujino, who picks up martial arts instead of drawing, ends up saving Kyomoto from the attacker. After this chance meeting, Kyomoto draws a manga strip about being saved by Fujino, which then gets blown away and slips under the door back to Fujino in the present. The result of this long alternate reality story is that Fujino receives this manga strip in an echo of the way that Kyomoto found hers, reading it and finding the courage to open the door. In the same way that Kyomoto was able to overcome her fear and step out into Fujino's world, Fujino was able to do the same, finally opening the door and stepping into Kyomoto's room for the very first time. Once she's there, Fujino finally starts to see things from Kyomoto's point of view. The room littered with copies of Fujino's manga and stuff from their memories. From this experience, Fujino finally starts to see things from someone else's perspective. She realizes that Kyomoto would never blame her for what happened, and that even though they parted on bad terms, she still clearly loved Fujino until the end. And from that realization, we start to see the events of the past from a different point of view. Frames of Fujino and Kyomoto working on their manga together, this time with both of them as the focus. Images of Kyomoto doing things on her own and being just as large in the composition as Fujino is. This literal change in perspective mirrors Fujino's own realization about how Kyomoto wasn't just an extra in the story. She made her own choice to step out of that room, and she had emotions and feelings and motivations of her own. And this helps Fujino come to terms with the reality of Kyomoto's death. Even after her passing, Fujino was still taking full responsibility for Kyomoto leaving her room and ultimately being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But we see in the alternate timeline how Kyomoto would have ended up there whether she met Fujino or not. And this realization about Kyomoto's fullness of self and independence as a person is what allows Fujino to stop blaming herself. She finally sees the world through Kyomoto's point of view. She finally steps out of her own room and into someone else's. And from that, she gains a real insight into the person her best friend truly was. And after this realization, this big character moment, we return back to our foundational shot. This time, the scene outside of Fujino's window is big and bright. A world full of different people with perspectives and rooms all to themselves. And Fujino has finally found the ability to acknowledge these unique and varied perspectives of those around her, allowing herself to grow into a more considerate and mature person. At the very least, this is the story that I gleaned from Look Back. A story about imperfection and self-centeredness and the ways that sometimes we have to look back, to reflect on ourselves and the person we used to be. There's obviously a lot more to look back than what I discussed. There's a huge amount of meaning in its commentary on creation and discovery, but I think there's a ton of people out there who have already made videos about that, and frankly, I wanted to do something different. When you view the story of Look Back through the lens of its framing and shot composition, it tells a very vivid and unique story about growing up and stepping out into the worlds of those around you. And I hope that I was able to convey a glimpse into how I interpreted this movie. Thank you so much for watching.